Hello and welcome to Fast Talk, your source for the science of cycling performance. I'm your host, Chris Case. This week, our favorite physiologist, Dr. Seiler, is back on the program to talk about something that many of us get wrong, the distinction between overtraining, overreaching, and burnout. Often these terms are used synonymously, but there are many nuanced differences between these conditions, and that's what we'll explore in today's episode. We'll dispel any myths about these terms, point out the scenarios that lead to each, and talk through how to avoid the worst outcomes. While research on overtraining syndrome is still in its nascent phase, we now know about the complex hormonal and physiological complications that can lead to this debilitating condition, and we'll discuss that in depth. On the other hand, overreaching, and that term hasn't long been defined in the science literature, but as a training method, it has a long history. We'll differentiate between functional and non-functional overreaching and how to differentiate between those two scenarios when it comes to your training. Then there's burnout, that lack of motivation, that lack of get up and go, that mental fatigue that most likely all of us have experienced at some point. Is burnout an inevitable part of being a bike racer? We'll discuss. In addition to Dr. Seiler today, we'll hear from a host of great names in the endurance sports world, including Sebastian Weber from Inside, Jim Miller at USA Cycling, pro mountain biker Payson McKelvin, and Coach Neil Henderson from Wahoo. One final note before we dive in. In the episode, you'll hear Coach Connor describe his bout of overtraining syndrome. When we were recording the show, Trevor thought back through the haze of 25 years to try and remember the training volume that led to his issues. You'll hear him say in the program it was only 10 hours. On later reflection, he feels it was more like 15 hours per week, and that's a massive difference given how he was training at that time. So stay tuned for that discussion. And with that, let's make you fast. This episode of Fast Talk is brought to you by Whoop. Whoop is a fitness wearable that provides personalized insights on the performance of your sleep, how recovered your body is, and how much stress you put on your body throughout the day from your workouts and the normal stressors of life. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the Whoop strap is this sleep coach that they offer. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, something I like about this sleep coach is it's more than just a number. So they do give you in the morning a percentage score, how well you slept.
Quality indicator.
Right. Which I look at, but then I think the value is diving into it. You can really go, no pun intended, deep, where you can see the whole heart rate profile of your night of sleep. So you can see when you were awake, when you were in deep sleep, when you were in REM sleep. It'll really tell you a lot about how much was I waking up, how much was I moving around, how much good quality deep sleep did I get. You can dissect the nightly sleep patterns and learn a lot about yourself. And then once you've started to dissect that and learn what your typical sleep pattern looks like, then actually something that also goes beyond the assessment they give you is be able to look at a bad night or a particularly good night and see how it varies from what you are used to.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Dr. Seiler, Dr. Steven Seiler, to have you on the program. Welcome back to Fast Talk.
Well, thanks, guys. I feel pretty at home here in the hot seat with you guys.
Nice. Even though you're way over there in Kristiansand, Norway, enjoying a lovely late summer day.
That's right. The first twinges of fall seem to be in the air, so fall comes a bit earlier here in Norway, I guess, than it does in a lot of the United States.
I know you want to get right into telling a story about the backstory of this episode, Trevor. You got scolded publicly.
I did. I'm glad we went right there.
Yeah.
So this is not the typical subject that we've talked with you about, Dr. Seiler, but this is, I think it was a Twitter post.
Yeah.
I mentioned burnout, and you rightfully chastised me, saying I was using the term burnout incorrectly. And that sparked this episode of there's all these different terms. There's overreach, there's different types of overreach that we'll talk about. There's overtraining, there's burnout, and they are not the same things.
Right. sometimes people use those terms interchangeably and incorrectly. So, this episode is about differentiating those, talking about each of those, their attributes, the complications thereof, maybe even how you back out of these things and how complicated that situation can be. So, yeah, overtraining versus overreaching versus burnout and all of the complexities.
And I was commenting that I can't hear these terms again for another week because I spent so much time over the weekend practicing them just to make sure I get them right.
Well, we're all going to be on each other to make sure that the correct terminology is used in each situation. I can almost guarantee one of us is going to make a mistake, but let's all try to keep each other on track.
But to get us started, who wants to take on the kind of 1 minute overview? What is the difference between these three things?
Yeah, let's hear from Dr. Seiler.
Well, yeah, just to complete the puzzle, I think you can even start with a fourth one, but it's the easiest one because it gets us started. And that is you do a workout and you're tired after. And that's normal, that we train and we're fatigued immediately after and maybe for hours after to the next day. And hopefully we're recovered and we train again. So this is a cycle that we go through all the time as athletes. Now we take it a step higher and we're in a normal training routine. We're pushing, but now we want a little extra. We want to really, we add some volume, or we add an extra interval session each week, or we add even more. And we start stretching that rubber band, you might say, as a metaphor, with the intention that it will bounce back. We'll get a kind of an overshoot. And that's that classic general adaptation syndrome from our hero, Seiler, way back decades ago. And athletes use this, in training camps, in preparation for big events. They really dig in. They have the intention of sometimes, digging a bit of a hole for themselves. Swimmers are notorious for this. And then getting a super compensation. And if they get that right, then that's what we call functional overreaching. So it's an intentional, taking out the shovel, digging a bit of a hole for yourself physically, where performance actually declines a bit. You're really, you're pushing the volume, you're pushing the training load, and then you let up on the gas pedal. You give your body some recovery time in a taper, and you get, maybe a 3% overshoot. Well, that's fantastic. So that's functional overreaching. It may take days up to maybe 2 weeks to come all the way back and get that overshoot. Now, non-functional overreaching, it's not hard to imagine that just, you took it too far. It didn't work. You end up kind of damaging the rubber band, and you don't get the overshoot. And in fact, you get a delayed recovery. So you're starting down that pathway towards a more profound and more long-term deficit functionally. And this can take several weeks, maybe a month to come back from, maybe 2 months to come back from. But it's a fuzzy, the key difference definitionally between functional and non-functional is just, it's the function. Did you get that super compensation as planned, or did you, end up limping back to normalcy after, weeks of things not going well? And that championship event you were supposed to be really primed for, you end up sucking. You just weren't there because you end up pushing too hard. That's a typical non-functional overreaching situation.
That's really important. You can even see a non-functional overreach if it takes too long to come out of it. If it takes that month or longer, you can detrain. So you can come out of it weaker, not stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a critical distinction. And let's be honest, I would almost say functional overreaching is not for beginners. That process, it tends to be successful in athletes and coach-athlete groups or teams that really are tuned in, and they know how much they can, stretch that rubber band. They know that they've learned through experience what the athlete tolerates, and because it's tricky, and it can easily go the wrong way.
Yeah, you've used the rubber band analogy. You could also maybe talk about walking sort of right up to an edge with overreaching, and if you don't get it right, you go off the cliff, or if you stretch the rubber band too much, you snap that rubber band, and that's where we get into problems.
A lot of coaches like talking about the razor's edge. So functional overreach is going to the edge, non-functional overreach is going over the edge.
Yeah, and there are some sports. Swimming, I think, would be the one that I see most common. That is, functional overreaching is almost built into the psyche of the athlete. It's almost like they don't know how to not do that before a major competition. They really dig in deep. They count on that kind of super compensation from a hard overreach situation. But there's been some research. There are some studies that say that they're not even sure this actually works. That if you just train smart, you end up the same place. So the whole idea, I think it does work for some if they know how to do it. If they get that the increase appropriate, because it always involves an increase in training load, either through volume or intensity or both. So you are purposefully increasing the load at a higher rate of increase than you normally would. And that's usually a recipe for problems. When you do a pretty drastic increase in volume or, overall training stress, then there will be some negative consequences. Here, the goal is that, yes, we want that to happen, but we're going to control it so well that it's going to give us a bounce back.
Yep.
That's what you're gambling on.
I did a lot of research for this one, but I think the study or review I spent the most time on that I found really interesting was from this year, February of 2020, by a Dr. Bellinger, and the title of it is Functional Overreaching in Endurance Athletes, a Necessity or Cause for Concern. And he makes a pretty good case for the fact that, well, yes, you can get a supercompensation from functional overreach when you look at studies that compare functionally overreached athletes to athletes who just increase their training load but don't get functionally overreached. You see pretty equal supercompensation. So he's really questioning, is it necessary at all?
Well,
right.
And we're going to get into this more later, but that brings up the question of how does one determine if they're functionally overreached or not? And I know that's a tricky thing to answer, and we'll get into that later, but that is the first thing that springs to mind.
If there's ever been a guest on our show who's been precise about the definition of terms, it's Sebastian Weber, the head physiologist at Inside. And for good reason. He understands that you can go in the wrong direction if you're not clear on what you're talking about. So, when we had him on the show recently, we had to ask him his definition of overtraining.
What's the difference between overreaching and overtraining?
I cannot tell you, because the definition, obviously, of overtraining is pretty weak. So if you cannot define one of two items, you cannot compare them appropriately.
So that's interesting. So talk a little bit about that with overtraining and why you feel the definition is weak and what you think of it as.
So why I think the definition of overtraining is weak, there are tons of papers, and it's very difficult to really get a grip on how you, maybe I should not say define, but how you diagnose overtraining. Because there are so many different aspects to it. And the only common ground, so to speak, is maybe a drop in performance. And then you have to distinguish between fatigue and overtraining, right? So that's really a difficult piece here. There's not so much really, I think, I can contribute to that, besides the definition is difficult. And the only thing maybe I can contribute to that is saying that when you have these symptoms of or you have some symptoms of overtraining, then I would like to believe that is mostly derived from a kind of central fatigue. So we're talking about hormone systems. We're talking, mostly about hormone systems that which react, or which you can link to a phenomenon of overtraining. The muscle itself is pretty resistant and very, very good adaptable to whatever kind of training load. And the muscle itself has also a huge ability to recover if it is when it is in the right environment. And this is then, a little bit messed up to say in an overtrained scenario. For me, overtraining refers mostly to more like central fatigue or central issues or problems going on, and not so much on the local muscular level.
How do you identify that in your athletes? Like, what do you look for to say to an athlete, this isn't normal training fatigue, you're off course, we need to adjust?
Now, for me, we are talking more about how to get a grip on fatigue and recovery. And for me, one of the most important things, believe it or not, is talk to the athlete. Mm-hmm. Talk to the athlete and get his feeling. And sometimes it is on purpose that the athlete is fatigued and doesn't feel fresh and, is a little bit tired and feels slow and so on. And sometimes it's not on purpose. And that's important to communicate with your athlete. Even maybe you write it as a training program. Like, in this session or in this week, be ready to feel overall tired, more like muscular fatigue whatsoever. So first important thing for me is talk to your athlete. And then the second thing is, there are some measures which you can look at. I personally look at heart rate kinetics and heart rate to power kinetics as one indicator in the training, also to get a grip on some information what might be possibly going on during the training. You might want to call it heart rate uncoupling. I don't really think that's a lucky term for that, but or a nice term. But anyway, because it's difficult also to distinguish from dehydration. But that's something I look at personally. Then if it's really like an ongoing thing, we normally do a full metabolic profile. So we do a full test and look what's going on in VO2 max and so on, because especially in VO2 max, you will be able to see fatigue or overreaching or non-recovery and drop of performance. That is one of the very first metrics that actually will react. So that's a good indicator. And then on a short-term level, what I used was hormone levels. So we would check in the saliva, actually during training, we would check, for example, for cortisol reactions. Normally, if you are fresh, then you would see a reaction of cortisol levels after hard effort. And there's technologies where you can either, for example, monitor it on a daily basis, like morning measurements, which is important because cortisol levels depend on the time of the day as well. But we would actually use it also in training, where we would say, okay, like let's, for example, say it's Wednesday, you had a hard race on Sunday, and you want to understand, okay, are we ready yet? And the athlete also is not really sure. Do we want to do another harder effort, or we just want to keep going easy for a third day? We could do just one hard effort, a few minutes, 3-4 minutes, 2 minutes, something in that ballpark. Measure the cortisol levels afterwards. If it spikes, it's a good sign that you are, quote, quote, fresh again or fresh enough. If it doesn't spike up, if there's a blended reaction, then the athlete is not fresh and you should maybe keep going easy. So these are some of the tools I've been using.
So before that, let's finish defining overtraining and burnout, and then we can talk about how to differentiate them.
Right. So if you go several steps further, and if you have an athlete that has solved every problem with doubling down on training load, meaning that when it hasn't gone well, they have answered that problem by saying, well, I need to train more, they will be a candidate for that ultimate problem, which is overtraining, this overtraining syndrome. Now, the reason overtraining has been given this extra word at the end, a syndrome, is because syndromes mean that there's several ways to get there. And when that happens, in other words, there's this set of symptomology that may happen because of several different mechanisms, then they end up calling it a syndrome. And that's kind of where we're at with overtraining. You can be overtrained. Like I talked to a national team coach, and he says, look, we've had overtraining cases because of viruses, because of infections, where you've got this highly trained athlete that is on the razor's edge, but they're okay, they're doing well, and then they get mono or some other kind of virus that drags them down, and then they keep training, and the combination puts them into this overtraining state. That happens. But another way it happens, and the probably more typical way it happens, is just a long-term pushing the volume and the total load too hard and not recovering. Because basically, one way of calling it is overtraining, but you could call it also under recovery syndrome. And it's pretty hard to distinguish the two because they're two sides of the same coin. And in fact, if you look at the historical literature, under recovery has been one of the terms that's been used. And I should forgive you, Trevor, for also using burnout, because that term has also been used synonymously with overtraining. So the literature itself has been kind of, inconsistent. And I think part of that is just science has taken a while to figure this out. They've looked at different things, seen different symptomologies, different snapshots of what we might say is a continuum. And I think that's where we're at in our understanding of this, is that we're really looking at a continuum in a stress and recovery kind of balance, and different degrees that this stress recovery balance becomes shifted or out of balance, and how the body responds.
I think you brought up a couple important points. One about overtraining, the fact that it's not just you trained even harder than you did for overreach. But I think all the definitions I read had something on the lines, and I'm reading this right out of one review, says part of the criteria for overtraining is an additional trigger beyond excessive training load. So that's what you're saying. There was something else, like a virus or something. And as you pointed out, when I didn't use burnout correctly, burnout is much more mental. So that's simply, you just look at your bike and go, I don't want to touch that.
What is the literature saying now about the true definition of burnout? Is it exclusively mental, or is it a combination of physical and mental?
If I were going to do just the poor man's distinguish, how do I distinguish these? For me, overtraining is a physical syndrome, but it can have obvious psychological consequences.
Right.
Whereas burnout, at least from the way the literature I've read, burnout is more a mental stress related syndrome that can have physical consequences.
When I was reading about burnout, one of the things they talked about was monotony. There's actual metrics for monotony, but it kind of the term explains it fairly well. And there's just a certain point where you get tired of the training, where mentally it just gets tougher and tougher. And you just hit that point where you just don't want to keep doing it. You just can't keep pushing yourself. So in some ways, I would even say there is a form of burnout that happens in most athletes towards the end of the season, where you're just like, I'm ready to be done.
Right.
And you might call that a functional burnout, in the sense that, they almost should be there at the end of the season. But then they know that now the recovery period is coming. So you've kind of timed everything so that, they've used up that motivational energy at the right time.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a spectrum here, as you were saying. The overtraining syndrome is never a good thing. It's out at the extreme, to the left or to the right, whichever you prefer. Overreaching, however, sort of done correctly, can be a positive thing. It's what a lot of athletes use to get better, but it also has potential to be a negative thing. Burnout, on the other end of the spectrum, is never really a positive thing, but it's less extreme than overtraining.
Right. Now, burnout can occur while you're also overtrained or overreached.
Right.
They can go hand in hand.
Yep.
Dr. Eukendrup back in 2004 wrote a review where he questioned whether it was a continuum from acute fatigue to overreaching to overtraining, and did make the argument that actually overtraining might be something different that can happen concurrently. The other really important thing to point out is they didn't even officially define overreach until 2006. So this is evolving. And it was right around then when this concept of functional and non-functional came around. And when you are talking about, so when you hear people say, oh, I'm overtrained, I'm really tired, I need time off, normally what people are actually talking about is non-functional overreach. As Dr. Seiler said, overtraining is actually really rare.
Right.
Yeah, so that, and most of the people listening to this show, because statistically speaking, most of them are not pros, they're not elites, and they're age groupers, they're guys that are, have normal jobs and so forth. It's really hard for them to hit a true overtraining state. But that terminology, it's just kind of like the term anaerobic. It just kind of gets misused a lot and used for anything high intensity. Now everybody says, oh, I've gone anaerobic, or now I'm overtraining. So unfortunately, the term is misused. I do think, though, a lot of age groupers are chronically overreached, meaning they're in that stagnation phase that you could call non-functional overreaching. But then it gets trickier to say, are they overreached or are they just training wrong?
Right.
And and really, to be honest, when I was kind of trying to find my legs as a sports scientist and decide what I wanted to do, I was looking at all. That's when this overtraining research was really in its peak. I said, well, I don't really want to study how you do it wrong. I would kind of like to figure out how to do it right. How to, what if this is the wrong thing to do, then what's the right thing to do? What's correct training look like? And that was really, in a way, my motivation for kind of going down that pathway that I have, which has been more on these issues of trying to optimize the training process and all this intensity distribution and so forth. But what's interesting about it is it ends up going full circle, because after 20 years of doing this, when I look at trying to understand correct training, it is about that fine-tuned balance between signal and stress, which, years ago, that's what overtraining, the literature was talking about, is overtraining is, fundamentally a failure to get the balance between training and recovery, or training and stress, or signal and stress. You can choose your metaphors to get that right.
Right.
So it's the backside of all the research, all those things we talk about with intensity distribution and volume progression and all of that. They are intimately related, in my mind. It's kind of approaching the problem from different directions. And the problem with understanding overtraining and overreaching is you really can't diagnose it until it's already happened.
Yes.
You're kind of like, you say, yep, that was a train wreck. Well, it's a little late,
Yep.
We asked Jim Miller, USA Cycling's Chief of Sports Performance, his thoughts on overreaching. And he also brought up that important balance between training and recovery.
How do you explain, or what's your definition of overreach versus overtraining versus burnout, and what have you seen in athletes you've worked with?
I think it's always underresting. Your body is actually really capable of handling a massive amount of anything you throw at it. I always use the Grand Tour, for example. If anybody were to ride 21 days of 6-hour rides with 2 rest days, but on those rest days you have to ride an hour and a half so you don't shut down, everybody in the right mind would be like, that's an insane training program. What idiot writes this? But yeah, guys do it 3 times a year, and they've done it for 75 years. So you're humanly capable of it. The issue is always underresting, and I think people underrest. That's most of their issues. And you do it for example, you do a 10-day training block. Ideally, after 5 days, the athlete generally says, "Oh, I feel okay." You as a coach say, "Okay, let's do a little bit of work." Or you as a coach say, "We've rested for almost 7 days and it's time to go back to work." But if they're not rested, they're not rested. And any time I think you finish training blocks or hard racing blocks, the first thing that has to happen is they have to be rested. Without the rest, then the next block isn't as good.
I wrote an article a long time ago that was a little bit controversial, but that was the theme of it. My message was, there's no such a thing as overtraining. There's only under recovery.
That's what I think. And, the same human, I guess, sort of analogy is, as humans, we're so adaptable to anything. It's like if you stay in 4 seasons everywhere you travel, you become accustomed to 4 seasons and you believe that you can only stay in 4 seasons. Vice versa, if you're a prisoner of war and you get put in a cage, ultimately you can become fairly accustomed to that cage and you just adapt to the circumstances and survive. So I really think with training, if you rest appropriately, then you can pretty much throw anything at them that you want to throw at them.
I guess the question becomes, and this I know is a big question, how do you know what is the appropriate amount of rest? What do you look for in an athlete to understand whether they're leading towards being overtrained or burnout? Do you look for signs in their mood? Do you use devices? Is it all of those things? Look at the comments they're making in their training records?
Yeah, all of it. I think you have to. That's where I think not one metric tells a story, but collectively they will tell you what is happening if you look for them. And for me, really, at the end of a training block, before we start another training block, I like to hear them. I like to talk to them and hear their voice, what they may say in a text or what they put in their training notes, whatever analytics you're using or saying. Those are all good and very objectable, but I like to hear them. Especially if I know it was a really hard training block, and then make my decision that way. And a lot of times with rest, if there's a time to err on the side of caution, that's it. So if I'm undecided, like, do we start training today or do we start training tomorrow? I will almost always just default to tomorrow. Give it another day. It doesn't hurt. One day of rest won't make or break you.
But getting back to training before you're ready, that makes a big difference.
Yep. And if you listen to athletes, right, they're always going to tell you they're good. Almost always.
Yes. Well, especially if you're built warriors, right?
Yeah, that's it. They're good. They're ready to go. And that's where you have to proceed with caution.
What is the way of indicating you're heading towards a non-functional overreach or even overtraining? And they so far have not been able to find a biomarker. They found hormonal changes, but they basically said any sort of even just acute fatigue is going to produce those hormonal changes. There's minor changes in immune function, but nothing that really gives you that big red flag. So the way, when you look at the definitions, how they show the differences between this non-functional, functional, and overreach and overtraining, the biggest one is just length of recovery, which doesn't really help you because you don't know until you're in it.
Exactly.
Yeah, like how bad was it? Well, that's not very useful to us at all.
If it takes you days to a week to recover, that's functional overreach.
Mm-hmm.
If it takes you weeks to a month, that's non-functional. If it takes you months to years, you were overtrained, but that's after the fact.
Yeah,
Right.
Not very helpful in the moment.
But another one that can be helpful, that a lot of the more recent studies and reviews that I read, is a drop in performance. If you are pushing yourself, so in all these you're going to feel fatigued, even just that acute fatigue you're talking about. You go and do a couple hard training days, you're going to be fatigued. But it's one of the lines that you can cross is when you start seeing your performance drop. Then you're starting to get over that razor's edge.
Right. And a drop in performance is the golden criteria for all of these. They're all associated with a state where the athlete's performance has declined despite the maintenance or even an increase in training load. So that's kind of by that definition is there for all three states. But what comes after that is the difference. So you're right. That's the first signal. I think, but then I guess what you also want to start looking for is I'm seeing a drop in performance. This workout, these last 2 or 3 workouts, I'm not holding my usual threshold power during these threshold sessions. I'm down 20 watts. So that's the first, that's a canary in the coal mine for sure. And then, often I would want to, if I'm the coach, I'm going to want to triangulate that with some other stuff, heart rate and perceived exertion. Is this feeling harder? Or initially you may see that the athletes, you're seeing this decoupling, the heart rates are higher than they should be, but then later in the process, they actually may be lower.
Right.
And then that's corresponding to the fact that the entire system has become depressed. So their max heart rate has gone down. So heart rate is tricky. Blood lactate may go down, but that also can be associated with their max lactate is going down. So, there's different phases in this development that you can try to capture by triangulating with, that physical performance. We always, we're measuring power and pace for key workouts where we kind of have a good idea of where they should be. And then we're looking at perceived exertion, either using the metrics or just using good sensitive, feeling. And we're doing a little physiology. We're occasionally measuring heart rate and lactate, and we're looking at that relationship. And is it changing in an abnormal way? So the same tools that we use for monitoring, they're the tools that are available to us for trying to avert the beginning of an overreach situation.
Yep.
Or titrate it really carefully if that's the goal.
You brought up that really important one of the that drop in heart rate. So there are some recent studies that talk about parasympathetic hyperactivity, which is just going to bring that heart rate down. So you see at both maximal and submaximal intensities, your heart rate lower than normal. You also see after an effort, your heart rate comes down much quicker. And I certainly, when I'm working with my athletes, when I have them do a fatigue block, once I see that drop in the heart rate, I don't like to see them go that much longer before we take a break. Now, when you talk about Tour de France athletes, they're in that state after the first week and then just keep pushing through it for a couple of weeks. And we'll talk about how, what's a normal training heart rate becomes their max by the end of the Tour de France. So that is
for sure. Well, the Tour de France is an excellent example. I would, for most, for the domestics, the guys like that, it's a non-functional overreach protocol for them. Occasionally you'll hear, Tour de France riders that maybe were protected enough that they were able to pick and choose their battles, that they can almost go straight from there. A week later, they've competed in track championships and taken gold medals. So that extreme 3-week loading can either be functional overreaching or non-functional overreaching, depending on their position in the peloton, what their role is, and so forth. But for sure, it's an overreach situation for them.
Yep. Now, I think the most interesting part of the conversation we're going to have today is this difference between functional and non-functional overreach and whether it's needed. But before we go there, do we just want to dive into overtraining and try to explain to everybody how extreme overtraining is, just so that people understand how much we're differentiating this?
Yeah, I think it's worth illustrating the extreme nature of this, how that would help people understand that when they toss that term around, they're using it incorrectly, most likely. I know, Trevor, you have personal experience here, so we can have you share that as well. And I guess one of the questions I have, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to this, is how long do you have to go? You're talking about the Tour de France being 3 weeks. It's really hard. It's an overreach situation. For most guys, it's a non-functional overreach situation. How long they're not a good example maybe to bring up here, but for the average person, how long do they have to go in a non-functional overreach situation to tip over the edge and it to become overtraining syndrome? Is it's not that easy to answer that question, I would assume.
Well, I do think one of the important points was every definition that I read said there needs to be some sort of concurrent stressor.
Yeah.
So I actually think that there's a certain point you can train yourself as hard as you want. You can put yourself deep into non-functional overreach, but I think at some point you're going to shut down before you hit that true overtraining syndrome without other factors involved. Dr. Seiler, would you agree with that, or do you think you can truly train yourself just with training too hard, get yourself to that state?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I suspect that there have been cases of just a pure an overtraining situation that's occurred just as a function of continuously doubling down on the training. And I think that's why this is a bit less, or I hope a lot less prevalent now, the overtraining syndrome, this really severe state, because there's been so much discussion about it that I think coaches and athletes are more sensitive to it, that you cannot solve every training problem with more training.
Right. It's good to recognize that fact.
There have been periods where that has been the default for the athlete and the coach. Well, buddy, you just need to go harder. You just pick yourself up. Let's go. So that's, unfortunately, that gestalt has pushed some athletes into overtraining when really there was no reason for it to happen. In other words, there wasn't that additional stressor. But of course, the additional stressors come in. I think, for example, in the university sports settings where you've got athletes, scholar athletes that are trying to make grades and all these things at the same time and get the economy to work out for themselves and all this, then yeah, those are ripe scenarios for overtraining conditions, or overtraining, to slide into that overtraining state. And you throw in a little eating disorder issues, and then you've got a perfect storm.
I hate to say it, but a place where that attitude of, oh, you're not performing, train harder, is still quite prevalent is high school sports. You see a lot of high school coaches like, toughen up, and they don't recognize when their athletes are needing rest.
And now I just use the term burned out.
You were the first one.
Yeah. Would I owe you a beer now? But anyway, yeah.
Yes.
But they do.
Lone Star.
They do slide into each other. There's overlap in here, the mental and the physical. But maybe you should tell your story. Yeah, Trevor.
Yeah, exactly.
I did this in the 90s, and this was back, I had no understanding of the science. I was that dumb 20-something kid that was, I'm going to go train really hard because that's going to make me stronger. And when I started to see the drop in my performance, I went, that's because I'm not fit enough, so I need to train even harder. And actually, so even though I said there needs to be something concurrent, I'm not immediately thinking of anything that was concurrent. I just trained myself into the ground.
Was this post-college?
Yes, this was after college. And so there was a week that I really remember where it just flipped. It started with, I was living in Boston at the time. We had a Tuesday night race. And I was really struggling. I couldn't do my intervals. So I just I'm going to go to this race. I'm going to turn things around. I'm at the race. And back then, I actually, believe it or not, I had a good sprint. I had a good 1 minute effort. And there's this really steep 1 minute climb early in this race. So I was like, okay, I'm going to attack on that climb and see what I can do. I'm going to break away. I'm going to show myself. I'm going to show them that I'm back. And then I looked around and realized we're 40 minutes past that climb. And I had literally just
amnesia.
I could not
Overtraining-induced amnesia.
I spent the rest of the race trying to remember. There was 50 minutes of that race. I could not remember it all. Then it was just downhill. A couple days later, I got in my car and I couldn't drive because my feet were shaking so much I couldn't control the pedals. Wow. I'll give you the very short version, but I ended up going to the doctor. Most doctors don't understand overtraining syndrome.
Yeah.
They just assumed I was depressed, put me on an antidepressant. That led to really bad places. And that's actually been shown that when you're overtrained, there is an imbalance of serotonin and tryptophan. And so they put me on a serotonin inhibitor, which made things even worse. 2 days after they put me on the antidepressant, which was also, it was a combination antidepressant, anti-anxiety. I had an anxiety attack, a panic attack, which I've never had before, and went to the hospital, thought I was dying.
Jeez.
This ultimately, I got so dysfunctional, I actually ended up at the Mayo Clinic. I ended up there for 3 weeks, and they were testing me for ALS, MS, conditions like that, because I had out-of-control shaking. Like my fingers wouldn't stop shaking, my feet wouldn't stop shaking. Couldn't ride a bike at that point. And at the end of it, they just said, you have chronic fatigue syndrome, and sent me home. Because again, most people in the medical community who aren't sports doctors don't understand overtraining.
Mm-hmm. How does it look? I mean, that's an interesting question. How does it compare to chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, so that's one of the reviews I read about overtraining said it is actually one of those things that is a diagnosis of exclusion because it looks like so many other conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had a host of symptoms that when I would explain to the doctors, they just go, we don't know. I basically did not ride a bike for a year after that. I couldn't get on and ride. Like I could commute, that was about it. So I pretty much thought my cycling was done. It was over. A year later, I decided, no, I want to get back to cycling and tried. And it was a year. Well, so at the start of it, I would get on my bike. I would go up for an hour, easy ride, like averaging 13, 14 miles an hour, super easy. And that was all I could handle. And I would come home and I would get the shakes back.
Wow.
My digestive system would start really bugging me. I would get headaches. And it just took an hour ride of that. And I finally just went, I want to be a cyclist. So every day I went out, did my hour easy ride, come home. That night I'd be dysfunctional. All those symptoms, headaches, sweating, shaking, digestive system shutting down.
Sounds pretty familiar to your dysfunctions now, though, interestingly enough.
So I do suffer from migraines, and I do think that's one of the lasting effects.
Yeah, wow.
Because I don't remember having migraines before that. I went through that for a while before I finally started to be able to actually train. For several years after that, I was always scared to take more than a day off a bike, because if I took several days off of the bike, I'd have about a week of those post-ride strange symptoms again. So I was just always terrified of rest for a while. There are some effects that just never went away. Like I said, before that happened, we joke about how bad a sprinter I am.
Yeah.
I actually was a sprinter before that.
And now you're not at all.
I came back and I was a different type of rider.
A couple questions come to my mind. And I know that you can't apply your situation to anyone else's because everyone's different. But I'm curious, again, back to that question of how long did you push yourself before that you got to that race and that switch turn? And then the second question would be, and this is maybe a cautionary tale or a cautionary note will be in there, how does that compare to the training you do now? Because I think I know the answer, and it was far less, but you were a different person then.
Right. I did not know how to train, and I was not. Actually, the truth is I train harder now, but I know my limits. I know what I can handle, and as you said, I'm a much fitter rider now. But the year before that happened to me, I had a really good year. I was just starting to take up bike racing, and I was having going into the local races and winning them, and started to have that dream of making a career out of this. So the following year was, I'm going to take this seriously. And right from the start, It was train really hard. And I took that approach of every time I'm on the bike, I'm going hard. The idea of going slow, why would you ever do that? That's ridiculous. Basically, everything we talk about on the show, Dr. Seiler, everything that you have written about, I didn't do any of that. I was the intensity all the time, and very quickly started getting fatigued. And you know me, my stubbornness. And I just went, nah, keep going.
Yep. Head down, keep smashing it.
And I just went out every day, and no matter how miserable I felt, even when I couldn't do the intervals, I would just get angry at myself and try to force them out.
Yeah.
Try to push them. And it was definitely months of that before I started experiencing those things that I told you about. And even then, I tried to push it until, like I said, I was shaking so bad, couldn't sleep. I hit a point where I actually just couldn't get on a bike anymore. So that's overtraining. That is
Sounds like
something
it.
Fundamentally different from when we were talking about overreach.
And your recovery, is that typical, that it would take months to years, more likely years, to come back from something like this, that extreme?
I have a few friends who have also experienced overtraining to that extreme and heard similar things. It took years, and also had them say there are things that never, like I was a different rider, never the same after that. And like I said, I was certainly the same. I was more that sprinter, 1 minute effort type. Now I'm more the pure endurance with no big top end.
Wow. Interesting. So there were some just physiological, biological changes that took place.
Yep. And there are people who experience overtraining and never, probably because they hated the experience so much, never come back.
Right. Yep. Don't do this, people. Don't do this to yourself.
Don't do what I do.
Be smarter. Be smarter, train smarter, listen to this podcast more, whatever it takes. Just don't go to that extreme place.
I'm hearing a number of things. Number one, I think, you should not directly try to correlate the development overtraining with the actual training volume, because you can do a lot of training volume and never get overtrained if you manipulate intensity and rest appropriately. That's what you didn't do. And so you can get overtrained on 15 hours a week and do marvelously on 25 hours a week, with the difference being how those hours are being distributed. And I got to say, what I find is that the appropriate intensity distribution is a pretty strong vaccine against overtraining. Pardon the use of the term right now, but I think that's one of the key things you did wrong, and that a lot of athletes who become overtrained do wrong, and that is you develop this monotone, high intensity stimuli, that you're pushing pretty hard every darn day. And that, just lots of different research on animals, on humans, on that is just a great recipe for overstressing and, in a sense, burning out that organism, whether it's a rat or a human or a horse. If we go way back to our beloved general adaptation syndrome, which is that was Seiler, the idea of the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. In training, we're doing alarm and resistance, bouncing back and forth all the time, titrating those, trying to push, and the body, every kind of adaptation the body has, whether it's being able to handle alcohol better, or being able to handle heat better, or altitude, or training, they all have the same these stages. And what Seiler showed in his early rat studies, he put he started with 100 rats, he put them in a cold room. So the stress they had to deal with was cold. It was colder than they were used to. And it stressed them, but they adapted. And so they first had this alarm stage, and then they had this resistance stage where their bodies they lived in the cold. But he would take different rats out at different times, and he was able to show that there was also, even the rats that got well adapted, if they kept being stressed long enough, they fell apart. They failed. Their bodies eventually failed them because of that chronic stress. So then they fell into this exhaustion stage. So, we have the capacity to deal with stress for a long time, but all organisms have a limitation on how long we can handle that repetitive stress, and then you can exhaust the athlete or the organism. And one of the best ways to do it is with a monotone stress load.
Yep.
So I guess, if I was going to ever try to make that connection between overreaching, overtraining, and training intensity distribution, all those things we tend to talk about, I think the common denominator is the ability of the athlete and the coach to create the appropriate variation in those, in that intensity profile.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Going back to what Chris was saying, I put myself into that severe overtraining state. I was probably only training 10, 11 hours a week.
Yeah.
And got to the point later on when I was training right, where I was training 20 plus a week and fine.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the quick little bit I'll finish my story with, just to tell you how stupid I am. My first mentor, Glenn Swan, before I overtrained, I went and told him my plan, and my plan was stupid. It was train hard all the time, and since that wasn't even enough, I had this great idea of I was going to wear a weight vest because that was going to make the training even harder.
Nice.
And Glenn, when I told him all this, got so frustrated. He started, he was trying to explain to me how stupid this was, and he couldn't get the words out.
He didn't
so he
slap
just goes,
you across the face?
Wait here. Goes into his back room at his shop, comes out with this big board with a graph on it, which is the graph of the diminishing returns, but also showing the increasing risk of burnout and overtraining. So he explained all that to me. I listened intently and then walked out of there and went, well, what does the old man know? Mm-hmm. Then put myself through that overtraining and went, apparently he knows a lot. And went back to him after that and said, okay, re-explain this graph to me, which he did. And then when I was able, as I said, once I was able to train again, I did almost all low intensity. So I was up 18, 20 hours a week. And that first year, once I was able to do any sort of intensity, I'd only do one intensity session a week. Mm-hmm. That was it.
Yeah.
And completely turned things around. So I couldn't agree with you more that the distribution is such a huge part of this equation.
Interesting to see how awful overtraining syndrome truly is.
Yeah.
And how long-term, if not chronic, the effects can be. And we didn't even really talk about the mental side of it for you, but I'm sure it was pretty devastating for a while.
That was not fun, but the worst part of it was sitting in the hospital having needles shoved into my nerves to see if the nerves actually functioned or not.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, you guys, in preparation for this, I had a chat with a former national team. He was the national team cross-country skiing coach at one time. He's got quite a few Olympic and World Championship medalists to his credit. But he also just, maybe for whatever reason, maybe kind of his way, but he was very good at working with athletes that did fall into this overtraining syndrome. He didn't put them there, but they would come to him after, and he would work with them. So I had a little chat with him. I said, well, what's the formula? How do you bring them back? If you can bring them back. And it was interesting because most of what he said was all about psychology, all about relationships, all about, and then he kind of got into a little bit of the actual intensity stuff. But he says, look, the first thing you got to think about is it's going to be this, it's an elite athlete that's been used to all this, and they are at an all-time low mentally because everything they understand about their bodies has been turned upside down. Mm-hmm. He said in the worst case scenario, they're struggling. They are fatigued going out to the post box. And he says, so you take a person that has been in a high level performer, and they don't recognize their body and the way it's responding. And so he said, look, the first thing you got to have is you got to have one person that you trust, a support person that you two are going to go into this process together. And he was saying that they will need often somebody to talk to, and somebody who can help them recalibrate from their old way of examining themselves and evaluating their performance to a different calibration during that recovery, or else they'll never get there. Because he says they're going to have to celebrate very small victories in that build-up process, which you were talking about, going out for 20 minutes, and coming home and feeling exhausted, but saying, well, yeah, but 20 was better than the 10 I could do last week.
Sounds very, very much like coming back from a severe injury of some other kind, whether it's a broken bone or something else. Those small victories are the stepping stones that bring you back. Right.
And as Trevor alluded to, that the volume comes before the intensity. Letting just being able to get to an hour to maybe 2 hours before you even think about some small surges where you say, all right, well, now we're going to go up for 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds up into that kind of threshold zone. And then we're going to come back down.
Yep.
And if we do that once or twice, or, in this workout, and we come home and now, no, you feel more exhausted tonight, because it's tougher, but it's just that very careful titration that he described of volume, intensity, and then being satisfied with that progress, because it will, it can get better. You've shown it does get better, but you have to do something very different than what got you there in the first place. Yep. You have to break your own instincts in terms of trying to recover quickly, trying to do it too fast, because that will almost certainly put you back. That was his, a lot of what he was telling me. This can work, and it does go. It doesn't have to be the end of a career. Good things can happen, but it's a very careful process. And you're comparing it to a severe, bone injury or something. I think that's reasonable to, I can remember when I had knee surgery, I had the patella tendon rupture, come off the bone. And man, I thought after that surgery for months and months, I thought, I'll never be the same. I'll never function, but it just slowly got better. And that's the thing. The body can heal. The nervous system, the endocrine system can restabilize, but it has to be just coaxed there very gently over time.
For a month, I had a rule that I could not break a 123 heart rate. I can't remember why I landed on 123, but I always remember the number. And my max heart rate was close to 200 at the time. It was super, super easy.
Is there any data to suggest what type of athlete is most prone to overtraining? Amateur, professional, veteran, elite, totally beginner?
Not that I know of. I mean, obviously, Trevor kind of proved me wrong, because I've tended to say, look, if you're not training at least 10 hours a week, you probably can't get truly overtrained. But I guess if all 10 of those training hours are at threshold plus intensity every workout, then I guess you can. You proved me wrong, Trevor.
Not in the way I wanted to.
Yeah, not the best of ways. All right, well, that's overtraining. We said we were only going to talk a little bit about it, but it's in some ways a pretty fascinating syndrome. It's not pleasant, but it's fascinating.
If an athlete has prepared themselves, and they've planned a season, and there's some highlights, and there's some key big events, and that I don't think it's that unnatural to expect. I would almost call it a functional burnout at the end of the season, meaning that they are towards the end of the season, if everything's gone well, they get past the championship event, it goes well, and they're pretty much not too motivated. They are burned out temporarily. Well, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I experienced that with my daughter last year, and I said, well, that's all right. Now you're going to take an entire month off. And so, I don't know if we want to touch on that, but the fact, Kipchoge, the great marathon, he takes a month off after one of those major builds and major races. The ability to allow yourself to do that is perhaps kind of connected to this idea of burnout. Between seasons, it's really important to have that unload period as much mentally as physically. So maybe this cycle of kind of a build up and a burn down or a burnout at the end of the season, there is a natural ebb and flow of the enthusiasm, the energy of the athlete that is okay. It's okay to be tired. It's okay. And I think, particularly collegiate athletes, they hit the end of a season, the semester, they've got their final exams at the same time, they've got championship events. So I think it's normal, to feel burned out. But what's not normal is to not listen to that and give yourself a freaking break, literally, for a period of time, and allow that mental energy and physical energy to return.
How many seasons would you say you've ridden, Trevor, where you haven't had some amount of burnout at the end of the year? Is it just almost an inevitable thing?
I've had a few where I haven't,
mm-hmm.
but those are usually actually pretty unsatisfying years. Mm-hmm. It's because I feel like I finished the season
with a little bit left in the tank.
Like I didn't accomplish everything.
Yeah.
I like to finish the season where I go, yeah, I'm ready to hang up the bike and not look at it for 3 weeks.
Right. Yeah. I bet a lot of people feel that same way. It's kind of like the energy stores that they have reach that part of the season, and they meet up, and you're like, okay, it's time, Yep. And it's hopefully at the end of the year and not in May, because that's when you get into trouble, sometimes.
I would say that's the only danger, is if you're starting to have that feeling in the middle of the season. And when I have an athlete experience that, my general recommendation is let's take a week off the bike and get that little mini rest.
Yeah. Reset some things, get hungry again.
And that's I think these two, the physical aspect and the mental aspect of these long performance years are similar. At a high level, because of television and World Cup seasons and so forth, the athletes have a lot more competitions than maybe they did decades ago. And it's hard to maintain the training during the season because you're going from race to race. This is at least true in some of the, like cross country skiing and running and so forth, is these World Cup schedules have stretched longer and longer. So sometimes what athletes are doing is they're just hopping off the train at some point. They're jumping off of the World Cup cycle for a couple of weeks in order to both recover mentally, but also to just put in a volume period. So, and the two go together. So I'm seeing a lot of that. That's what we did with skaters when we were working, the speed skaters, is they just, the best ones realized, well, look, it's not my job to be at every race to satisfy a television audience. If I don't give myself some time in the middle of this season, I won't be there at the end where I want to be. So I do think that mid-season burnout issue can be a factor when there's a lot of races, a lot of competitions that you want to do well at, and you have to make a few choices. You may need to go against your wishes and not compete, and give yourself a little mid-season, what should we call it, a hiatus.
Let's turn our attention to overreaching, because in a way, this is where some people out there can actually benefit from a the positive side of doing this right. So shall we talk a bit more about this topic of overreaching?
So I just want to throw one quick thing out, and then Dr. Seiler, take it away. But there's been some recent research on functional overreaching, really questioning, is it necessary? And I think one of the biggest studies that keeps getting referenced is this 2014 study led by Dr. Aubrey. Actually, I don't know if it's doctor, his first author, but I'll say Dr. Aubrey.
How do you spell that?
Aubry.
Very good.
I think I got it right.
I think you did.
And so this study, they tried to, they increased the load on the athletes trying to put them into this overreach state. But they found that some went into the definition of functional overreach, others did not. And they were looking at in terms of so everybody reported, yes, I'm tired, I'm fatigued. So they really talked about this difference between acute fatigue and overreached. And their differentiator was the overreach athlete saw a decrement in performance. Then they had a 2-week taper after that and found the ones who didn't see a drop in their performance had a supercompensation after the taper. The ones who were functionally overreached by their definition just went back to baseline. They actually didn't see a supercompensation. So this has raised this question of, is an overreach actually necessary to improve? And that's really the thing I wanted to bring up. So please, Dr. Seiler, take it away.
Yeah, and I have to say, I haven't done any intervention studies where we have purposefully tried to create an overreaching state. And if I talk about the daughter who I coach, I do not purposefully try to put her at any time in an overreached state. Maybe I think it's too early in her career to play that game yet. We just focus on doing things well, and so I just am going on feeling here that, again, my feeling has been, based on all the research that we've done and lots of, just being around athletes, that, if we go back to that hierarchy of training needs, doing some type of a functional overreach protocol where you purposefully increase the load more than is good for you, or it's going to have negative consequences, at least temporarily, that's going to be way up on top of the hierarchy. That it's going to be the kind of thing I'm going to do with an athlete only after all the good, basic, normal training process is no longer creating continued progress. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
That would be because these functional overreach protocols where you really try to push the athlete into a state of, a depressed performance state, get them really tired, try to get the super comp. It is a high risk strategy, and it can work, but you need to really know the athlete. I know, for example, an athlete that did this successfully was a guy named Olaf Tufte. He won the gold in rowing in both 2004, 2008. And he didn't win a lot of World Cup races, but he was able to do just a perfect super comp period before both the Athens Olympics and the Beijing Olympics, and win the gold medal in the single sculling in rowing. And that's what he did. And he had it timed so well that he was still recovering from his overreach protocol, or we call it a super comp protocol. He was still recovering in the first rounds of the competition, but he gambled that, he was good enough to get through the early rounds without being at 100%. So they were literally part of his timing. Now, so then, you're really pushing things when you're using the early races as part of your recovery towards a super comp, final where you win the gold medal.
Yeah.
But he pulled that off twice.
That's
so I
living
know
on the edge.
it's living on the edge, but it was an athlete that had been in the game 10 years and had a coach athlete interaction where they were willing to take that chance, and they learned how to do it. They found, he knew his body really well, and he was able to make it work.
Yep.
So I'm not saying at the highest levels of performance, that those are the kinds of things you do that separates gold and fourth place often. But for most of us, I think you need to focus on getting the basic things right before you do those high risk type protocols. If for a lot of people, they're just going to mess themselves up. Now, to that end, if I wanted to try an overreach protocol, or try to create an overreach situation, I might then use a block periodization model where I would put in a block of, for example, higher intensity work, or it could be a volume block, but that's how I would use the block approach. And what I mean by that is a limited period, like a week, where you're doing more high intensity sessions than you normally would. You're stacking the deck with high intensity sessions for a certain number of days, like a week. So if normal for me is to do 2 hard sessions, I might do 5. That would be a big surge for me, and I'm going to get really tired. But if I get it right, then I'm going to get a bounce, 10 days later.
Yep.
So I think that's where we see block periodization being used in conjunction with a functional overreach process. It can be successful.
And I think it is important here. You said this right at the beginning of the episode, but just to remind people, there's a difference between fatigue and a functional overreach. You do need to stress yourself to improve. So don't think if you go out and do a hard weekend, don't go, oh no, I'm functionally overreached.
Right.
Most of the studies that look at functional overreach, their protocol is at least 2 weeks, generally 4 weeks. So this is an extended period of pushing intensity, pushing volume, and putting yourself in a fatigue state for an extended period of time.
Right. And I certainly wouldn't do it unless I had a good base that, you've got, and I would start with a healthy athlete, no injuries, no infections, good base, and feeling good. And then say, all right, you're in a position where we can take this risk of initiating this 2 or 3 week period where we're going to really go hard and then look for the bounce, like you're saying. So I think you need to check off some boxes with your athlete, before you agree to do this procedure. It's like an elective surgery, this may go wrong. So you need to be aware of the risks. But if you're going to do it, then you do it correctly. You do it according to the demands, which means you're going to have to push. You're going to let them get pretty tired. And for an extended number of days.
Payson McKelvin, host of the Adventure Stash, has had a successful career as a professional mountain biker. So we asked him if he had experience with overreaching or even overtraining.
I mean, from a burnout standpoint, not really. I mean, mostly when I felt quote unquote burned out, it was when I was younger, and it was when I had preconceived notions about how a couple of races were going to go, and I just really, what I thought, underperformed and questioned my place in the sport, and decided I was going to quit for like a day. Never lasted long, but that's kind of the closest I've been to burning out. In regards to just totally overcooking myself physically, I'd say there's kind of only one time that's happened, and I was able to sort of abort when I saw it coming, and that was when I tried to do the Leadville 100 and the Breck Epic stage race back to back a few years ago. And I kind of should have known, but I had a career race at the Leadville 100 where I got in this kind of hilarious battle with the the current world champion at the time, Albin Licata. And because I was going, to the line with the rainbow stripes, I dug to a place that I haven't really before. And then the very next day tried to start one of the most brutal 6-day stage races there is. And I think it might have worked okay, except for the fact that they're both so high. And so you just don't really recover hardly at all when you're sleeping at almost 10,000 feet.
Right.
So I was digging into a hole. And it got to the point where not only like muscularly was I kind of falling apart, but I didn't have it in me to keep trying. And then also I started developing kind of a little bit of knee tendonitis, which I hadn't had for years and years and years. And for all intents and purposes, my body was just completely falling apart. And so on day 3, at the end of day 3, we pulled the plug on that. And it took me a while to come back around, much longer than you'd expect for 4 days of work. And I think that was the closest I've gotten to really screwing up from a workload standpoint. In terms of, functional overreaching, absolutely. That's such an interesting one because, you wonder about events like Kansas where you get so tired and still have 4 hours to go. And it's like, is that beneficial? Like, is that pushing you to a place where your body is forced to adapt and you kind of unlock something that you wouldn't otherwise? And with Kansas, I haven't noticed that. I haven't noticed a massive rebound in fitness, a couple weeks later. Maybe once I'm a little older and I have more hours in my legs, maybe I will. But that's a scenario where I don't think that ginormous effort like that pays dividends necessarily. Personally, I think events in the 5 to 6, maybe 7 hour range, I have noticed that. So for example, last year, I really decided to commit myself to the gravel scene just because it's a world that's exploding to a degree that's hard to ignore. And so all of a sudden I had a whole lot of events that were 6.5 hours, rather than the 3 to 4 hours that I'm used to. And we did this White Rim project, which involved a 5.5 all out time trial for all intents and purposes. So I had maybe, 7 or 8 efforts like that previous years, that would have been my single biggest effort of the year. And there'd only be one. And we did quite a few of them. And this preseason, the degree to which my depth has improved is really amazing. Like the fatigue resistance is definitely a step up. It's not like, year to year progress. There was absolutely a leap where it just takes so much more for me to get tired. And I have to assume that it's a lot of those bigger efforts, and the fact that we did 6 or 7 of them. In regards to more training camp stuff, I can't think of a scenario where I've really tested the border of just deep fatigue like that. Now and then there'll be some stage races that kind of get you there. I did the Mongolia Bike Challenge a handful of years ago, and that was 6-ish hour days in a row. But there was a lot of dirt road, so it was more of like a road race almost in some ways. And I think with those ebbs and flows, it was just the right amount of load, and I had a big leap in fitness after that. But I mean, beyond just traditional big stacking weeks, I haven't gotten too crazy with it, I wouldn't say.
This episode of Fast Talk is brought to you by Whoop. Whoop is a fitness wearable that provides personalized insights on the performance of your sleep, how recovered your body is, and how much stress you put on your body throughout the day from your workouts and the normal stressors of life. What's great with Whoop is that every day when you get up, you get a recovery score based on your HRV, resting heart rate, and sleep performance that can be used as an indicator to how to approach your day. The Whoop app has built-in features like the Strain Coach, which actually gives you target exertion goals worked out optimally for the level of intensity your body is signaling it can handle, perfect for working out at home. And based on how strenuous your day is, the app has a built-in sleep coach, which actually lets you know how much sleep you should be getting so you can wake up and be recovered based on your performance goals, which you can set.
Whoop is offering 15% off with the code FASTTALK. That's FASTTALK at checkout. Go to Whoop, that's WHOOP.com, and enter Fast Talk at checkout to save 15%. Sleep better, recover faster, and train smarter. Optimize your performance with Whoop.
One thing that you mentioned early in your description here, Dr. Seiler, was the fact that it takes critical oversight by the coach to get this right. But I'm curious to know, maybe this is more a question for Trevor, who I believe does use functional overreaching quite successfully, I would say. It's a partnership. The athlete has to be aware of things. It can't be that the coach is just monitoring things, because there are it's hard to see it in the moment when you're actually approaching this functional overreaching state. Is that correct? So the athlete is an active, willing participant in this procedure.
There are certain things that I look for. So again, they're still struggling with the definition and how to measure these. But as a coach, talking from experience, some of the things I look for are attitudinal changes. I think that drop in performance is a big one. So if you want to differentiate, I'm just a little acutely fatigued from I am now functionally overreached. If you're going out and doing intervals and you just can't hit the same wattage that you're used to hitting, you're getting into that functional overreach. If I have an athlete say, I've done some hard work, I'm fatigued, but they can go out and still do the intervals with the same quality, that's where I say, well, we're still relatively in the safe zone. And one in particular, there was actually even a study on this, is neuromuscular excitability. So I know several coaches who they'll look at that really short 10, 20-second sprint. And if you see a big drop in power there, that's an early warning sign. And as I said before, one of the things I ask athletes to keep an eye on is heart rate. Mm-hmm. Because when they start getting a little deep, that's when you see that blunting of the heart rate. If they go, I went out for a ride and I just couldn't seem to get my heart rate up, that's where I go, okay, if we're intentionally doing a functional overreach, okay, and we're getting close to where we need the rest, but this is, you're now in that overreach. If I'm doing normal training with them and I don't want a functional overreach and they go, hey, my heart rate seems low, I can't seem to get it up, that's sort of like off the bike.
Yeah.
Don't care what the plan is, we're resting.
Yeah. I mean, it brings up so many questions, and I know this is where coaching becomes an art, because there's not so much science to give direction here. So you're talking about you're wanting functional overreach. One session you go out, you're hitting all your target numbers. Another week later, you do that same interval session. You see that the numbers are lower than you would expect them to be if everything were quote unquote normal. How much is too much? Do you do that session if you're looking for the functional overreach, or do you pull the plug on that session, or do you do that one session and then pull the plug? I mean,
I would probably use a description, I flirt, but I don't push.
Okay.
So again, if we're in normal training mode and I see drop in quality in their intervals, I see that drop in their heart rate, it's, okay, we're adjusting the plan. You need rest. You're not where we want you to be. If we're intentionally doing that functional overreach, I want to see a little bit of that. I might push a day or two, and normally what I do is if we're doing a block, I'll start with the intensity. When we start to see that fatigue, I might say, let's do a day or two of some volume without the intensity, and then now we take a big rest. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to push them when I start seeing those signs. I'm not going to push them for another week or two.
Yeah.
And if I chime in as a 55-year-old kind of athlete-ish, I've
such a flattering description of yourself, Dr. Seiler. Don't go
You're
overboard
sending me
now.
your numbers. You have fantastic numbers, so you should give yourself credit.
Everything's relative.
He works with Olympians, so
that's fair.
It's all relative.
Yeah, that's the thing is, man, when I see their powers, I definitely get perspective on my abilities. So anyway, But at my age, at 55, I'm training 10 hours a week on good weeks. Maybe a really good week is 12, 13. Bad week is 7. So I'm in that, area. If I do 3, either like a Zwift race or a hard group ride, if I do 3 hard sessions in a row, then I'm experiencing that I can't get my heart rate up by that third one. Yeah. And how much? Maybe 5 beats, but that's my signal. That's my limit in that ebb and flow of, I'll do these little occasional experiments on myself to see what I can handle. And I can do 2 hard sessions in a row, 2 back-to-backs, but the third one already then my body's starting to put on the brakes a little bit. At my age. Now, I suspect for younger athletes, they in general, they may handle more before the brakes start to come on. But in that, if I were going to try to create a functional overreach, then I might push that to 4 or 5. But I don't think I could handle much more than that and come back within a week. So that's kind of my feeling, just based on lots of time spent in a controlled setting in a room in my loft, 600 hours on Zwift. I've measured myself quite a bit, and at my age, I can't handle more than 3 days in a row of high intensity where I'm going above 90% of max heart rate.
I think another important thing to point out, and this is more experiential, I've never seen this in a study, but certainly they have shown in the research when you're starting to push overreach, particularly non-functional overreach, you're going to see hormonal effects. You're going to see changes in your catecholamine response. You're going to see a whole variety of things happen in your body, with basically your body trying to deal with it's tired and you're still pushing it. And what I see in the early stages when somebody's starting to push non-functional overreach is variance. You're going to have days where you go out and you can't even do the interval work. But then 2 days later, you go out, the painkillers are flowing, and you all of a sudden hit your best 5-minute wattage that you've hit in the last 6 months. And I think that's what confuses a lot of athletes, because they're actually starting to get quite tired. They're pushing that non-functional overreach, but they have that one workout where they go, but that was amazing, so I can't be fatigued.
Right.
And they keep training.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing is the inconsistency is a sign.
Yes.
That the body is struggling a bit. And so time to recovery is not as consistent as it should be. Your internal clock is starting to get messed up. So I agree with that. And even high performance athletes, when they've had an injury, they've had changes in their training load, that's one of the first things you see is the inconsistency of their performance. Typically they're very consistent, it's 1% plus minus on their powers, and then suddenly it's not. Now they're having these really bad days and then the occasional good days, just like you say. So I think that is kind of a good warning sign to look at.
Don't latch on to that one good day and go, I'm still fine.
It's got to be really hard to identify it as an inconsistent outlier day when you're in the midst of things, though, right?
It is hard. And also remember, even when you're in normal training state, when you're not overreached at all, you're going to have bad days.
Exactly.
So don't worry too much about that. It's the trends. If you're going up and down a lot, bad sign. If you're just always down, really bad sign.
Right.
Periodic bad day, don't worry.
What I always look for in the training process is I'm trying to help the athlete achieve low lows and high highs. And what I mean by that is low intensity, they should have nice, easy technique, low lactate, low heart rate, but also still have that mobilization ability so that their peak lactates, their max heart rate is still high. And that when the athlete is in a really ideal state, at least that's what we've seen with, different speed skaters, middle distance and so forth, is they can go at they can have low lactate at low intensity and really high lactate at high intensity when they need it. And that means their system, they have full mobilization. They're well trained, they're fit, but they're also able to fully mobilize. The first thing that tends to disappear when they're getting into this overreach state is that top end. Now, max lactate is going down, max heart rate is going down. The body is starting to get this kind of what do you want to call it? A sympathetic insensitivity. You're not able to access the upper end of your sympathetic mobilization capacity. Does that make sense?
Yep. So I'll just give a quick story as a bit of an example. 2010, I had just come back from Canadian Nationals, and I'd put myself in a bit of I'd like to say a functional overreach, but maybe was pushing the non-functional. And I went to Dr. Samalan to get a test. So he was doing a ramp test, taking my lactates. And I'm looking at these lactates, they're like 0.7, 0.6, like really low. And I'm like, oh, great, I'm doing fantastic. And he stops me really early in the test. And he's like, your lactates are to the floor. You're exhausted. Go home. Don't touch your bike for a week and then come back.
Mm-hmm. You could see it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Remember, when glycolysis is accelerated with a sympathetic signal, that connects them. So that if you're not able to turn on the juice, you get that sympathetic response. There is a reason why glycolysis is depressed, lactates get lower. So, but it can trick you because we tend to think of low lactate as always good.
Right.
So unless you have that differential diagnosis, or what you might want to call it, where you also are looking a bit or have an idea of what the upper end of the scale is, because if it's probably also depressed, then you've just got an athlete that can't turn on the motor. But they both look the same initially. An athlete that's really fit, that has a really good right shift of the lactate curve, versus an athlete that can't mobilize. They also initially look like they have a right shift of their lactate curve, but it just turns out it doesn't go up. So that's why it looks like it's right shifted. They can't turn it on. They can't mobilize. So you end up needing this kind of differential diagnosis, if that makes sense. You need to see what the lactate looks like at two different intensities, one low and one high.
The question that comes to my mind, of course, and this was something you brought up earlier with one study in particular, is it necessary to do this to yourself, to ride this razor's edge, to stretch this rubber band as close to breaking as possible and then come back from it to reach peak levels? Is this something that people should not do unless they know it works for them, or unless they know it's they've got correct supervision and they know there's a team around them helping them understand where they're at as much as possible?
This is advanced. When you are at a high level, you probably need this.
It's kind of hard for me to imagine, but let's say I was an Olympic caliber athlete, top 8. And that means I've done some World Cups. I've had a 6th place, a 5th place, a 7th place. I've never been on the podium, but my federation is sending me because of my top 8 finishes, I'm seen as a possible medal contender. Yeah, I'm going to take that shot. I'm going to say, well, all right, the difference between me and a gold and a bronze medal or Olympic medal contention is about 1% consistently, 1.5%. But I need, I'm not going to cheat, but I'm willing to take a risk on a really tough super comp protocol, because 8th is wonderful, but I'm already in the Olympics. I've already made the team. Now I want to give myself a chance to do something extraordinary. So I think those are the kinds of situations where the effect, the benefit is so meaningful. The 1 or 2% you achieve can create such a big difference yeah, then I'd go for that. Now, if I am an age grouper training for my first Ironman and I want to have a good experience, I want to finish, I want to get under 11 hours or whatever the goal is, then no, I'm not going to do something stupid like that. I'm not going to take that risk. I'm going to try to get on the starting line healthy and ready to give my best, but I don't think I would put myself in that high risk situation because there's too many things that can go wrong, and I want to get through that race with a good experience. So those are, if I just use two different scenarios, it would depend a bit on what is the risk to benefit, or the benefit, if it means the difference between 8th place and a bronze medal in the Olympics, yeah, probably I'm going to go for it. But if I'm an age grouper, then I think I'm going to want to focus on being at the starting line, healthy and ready to give a great effort.
The thing I'm going to quickly add too is, let's put aside all this research that's saying it might not actually be any more beneficial than just normal good training. And let's say, yes, for everybody doing this functional overreach produces benefits, there's still the execution and making sure you do it right and you have the self-awareness to do this right. And the example I'll give you is, I always have my athletes rate their races, A, B, and C. So C just being a typical race, B being a race that has some importance, and A race have like 1 or 2 a year, and that's their focus race. And I would say of all the races where that my athletes have won or podiumed at, I would say 90% of them were C races. Because you see, when athletes start really focusing on a race, they get stressed. They start making different choices. They start doing different things that can lead to bad choices. And so my concern with people employing a functional overreach is, even if you did it perfectly, you're going to get that performance gain. I see too many athletes that do it wrong, that don't see the signs, that don't have the support, and end up going to the race non-functionally overreached and performing poorly.
Well, Trevor, you do this. You use functional overreaching to get to where you want to be, and you've done it for years. Are you going to change anything about that, or do you think you know it so well and you know it works for you and you know how to do it that it's okay? Or what? How is this?
Me personally?
Yeah, you personally.
I'm still going to do what I do, but what I realized reading a lot of this is I don't use it that much. Maybe once a year, twice a year. Mostly what I'm doing is just that acute fatigue.
These quote-unquote training camps that you do, 4 days, 5 days, not really enough to be considered functional overreaching.
They're really just more acute fatigue.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I build towards Tobago, I'll do that 3-week big build where, as Dr. Seiler was saying, I'll do 3, 4, even 5 days of intensity and really fatigue myself for a long time. But I know, having done this for years, because I've done it wrong a lot, I've learned the signs of when I'm off track, that I feel somewhat comfortable being able to do it. Neil Henderson, the head of sports science for Wahoo, has had a lot of experience coaching athletes through some very fatiguing training, and even big races such as Grand Tours. So, he had a lot to offer on how to identify fatigue and how to prevent overreaching and overtraining. What is your definition of overreaching versus overtraining? And do you intentionally take your athletes into any sort of overreach or overtrained state?
Yeah. So kind of a difference between an overreaching and overtraining is, with a reasonable rest and recovery, with that overreaching, you're going to see an improvement. With overtraining, with rest and recovery, there is no improvement, and you're only going to see decreased performance. So when we apply, when we're training, we actually get worse. That's part of the things. We have to disturb homeostasis. We have to stress our bodies. We initially get worse. It's when you recover that there's adaptation and improvement. That's what an overreaching or an overload achieves. Overtraining is such that you've done so much work that when you rest and recover, you do not get any better. And so that's kind of the big differentiator as I see things in that realm.
So in that sense, there is a benefit to overreaching. As a matter of fact, it sounds like you're saying it's almost a necessity.
Yeah, it's a component of things. Now, you don't have to have, overreaching consistently, always, all the time, but you have to have some level of that to improve. It's just part of the nature of the beast.
Now, when you're working with your athletes, how often would you intentionally put them into an overreach state, and how do you know when to say, yep, that's enough, stop, go rest?
Yeah, so I would say that kind of overload or overreach state is a few days each month where they're in that point of it, and you have to be careful of how long you stay in that state, and so it's literally only a few days out of a month or so. So towards the end of a training block, or occasionally we'll do a little bit of overreach on the front end of a block and then pull back a little and then kind of be at a more maintained level of stress that they can tolerate and adapt.
What do you look for to say, okay, you've been in that state for a couple of days? Are there numbers, or is it just your athlete saying, yeah, I'm tired?
A couple things that we typically see, that depression and heart rate for high intensity efforts, when we see that dropping more than, say 6 or 8 beats per minute from normal for a given effort, that's clearly an indication, and that's not going to be at like a steady state. It's going to be more at a high intensity type of effort. And then actually comments in a training log, seeing 3-4 days of kind of those negative feelings, and everything feels bad, legs are heavy, that kind of stuff for a day or two, not a problem. When it's 3-4 days in a row, we're pretty well into that point, and it's going to be time to pull out soon from that overload and recover.
Okay.
And honestly, not building rest into training schedules is honestly the biggest cause of getting there and staying there. So I pull back on training and recovery weeks much more, I think, than others. I may push forward a little bit harder. So some of those hard sessions are maybe harder than I've seen some other folks do, but then the rest and recovery is going to be a little bit bigger. So
what do you mean by bigger?
Like 2-3 days completely off the bike, and then another 3 to 5 days of relatively easy recovery rides would be kind of an offloading recovery week. That's fairly typical.
Love hearing you say that. And do you get the same thing I get from your athletes saying, but I'll detrain, that's too long?
Yep. And it takes till they go through a few cycles till they start to embrace it. But getting them to rest and recover is the hardest part of the training.
Yeah.
A lot of times I want to do the work, I want to work out. Yeah, great. Okay. Then you're going to have to also do the rest, and you have to do it well. If you don't rest well, you're not going to adapt to this. You don't get better.
We've had this long discussion. It's been very interesting, and I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but it sounds like Dr. Seiler, and for the most part, Trevor, you're actually saying 99.9% of the listeners of this show should probably stay away from it. There's probably some pros out there listening that maybe, Tour de France riders that are listening. Hopefully there are. And they could do this and could reap the rewards. But everyone else really should stay away from this. They should know what it is. They might try it, but for the most part, they should probably stay away from it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like the plague that you're trying to avoid, I have such good faith in smart training, in doing, in getting the intensity distribution right, and that it solves so many problems that I first want my athletes to do that well before we add this icing on the cake. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor, because it is more risky. Like if I go back to my daughter, she's, got a series of races now coming up, Norwegian championship races in different events, a half marathon and 10,000 meter on the track and so forth. And, for a lot of athletes, I think instead of talking about functional overreach protocols, it's just about peaking. They want to hit a good peak. They want to peak for their A race. But the problem is that they maybe, if they're like my daughter, every race has the risk of becoming an A race in their head because they've always got something to prove, either to themselves or others. And that's where things get tough, because you can't, it's very difficult to peak week after week. In fact, you basically, by definition, won't be able to.
Correct.
So then and I've had these conversations with her and have said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to hold back on the throttle a little bit in training, because the races themselves are part of your training stimuli. And I'm going to put you on the starting line in a good position to have a great day. But I'm not sure, probably not going to have a great day all of those races. But we're going to try to put you on the starting line close to a peak, close enough that the normal variation will give you, hopefully, out of 4 races, 2 that are going to be really good. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I just try to kind of prepare her mentally for that reality, that's kind of where we're at. And I think that's an honest appraisal of how the body works. And instead of trying to think that you're going to have such a perfect control over your peaking process that you're going to be able to achieve this exact peak race after race. Now, this is it may sound like I'm going a little bit off topic, but I think they're related. These, we try to peak. The overreach protocol can be part of a peaking process. But in my training prescription, I don't want her to have any bad experiences during those hard interval sessions leading up to a big race, because I find them to be so important in telling her state of readiness that I wouldn't want to use them in a negative way at this stage in her career, because I don't think she could handle the psychology of having a bad interval session, but then hoping that she's going to bounce back. Instead, I want her to have a good interval session that says, hey, you're where you want to be. We're there. We're on track. Does that make sense? So maybe it has to do with where the athlete is in their physical and emotional development, their training, because they've got to be able to deal with that mental frustration of their body not answering to their expectations when you do those overreaching situations like you do, Trevor. And my 22-year-old daughter that doesn't work for her psyche. That's my experience. She needs to have a good interval session where the numbers look good.
The flip side of this, the getting it correct is really what your focus has been. And for those who don't know our previous discussions, those 3 episodes, I think it's been 3 at this point, where we talked about polarized, we talked a little bit more about high intensity, we talked about some other nuanced topics within that realm. That's really what you're saying is go listen. If you don't want to flirt with functional overreaching, if you want to quote unquote train right, get the distribution right, go listen to those 3 episodes. And that's what we're talking about as an alternative here.
Well, yeah, and I don't want to sound, yeah, I'm going to be honest. I think that's true. And the other thing is, I would say, before you can use a functional overreach purposefully, you need to make sure you're not in a chronic state of overreaching non-purposefully. Does that make
Yes.
I think we've got a lot of people, maybe hopefully not your listeners, but a lot of age group athletes are in a state of kind of stagnation, at least, in overreaching possibly as a default, and they're not even aware of it. So their bodies are not going to be responsive to a functional overreach protocol because they're in a chronic state of not getting that distribution right. And so, and I've had athletes say, you know what, when I changed my intensity distribution, my max heart rate went up 10 beats. I think I have been chronically overreached for years. They've literally said that. So my point of all this is say, well, let's make sure you're not doing the overreaching without knowing it before you try to do it on purpose.
Right. Absolutely. Just for listeners out there who may want to know the numbers on those, episode 51, Polarizing Your Training with Dr. Steven Seiler. That was the episode that really kicked off our relationship, I would say. Episode 54, Applying the Polarized Training Model with Dr. Seiler. We also had High Intensity Training with Dr. Seiler, episode 75. And I think we talked sort of about the historical roots in the past, present, and future of polarized training episode, and that was episode 100. We saved that for a big number.
Yeah. Continuing with what you were saying, we got a fair amount of feedback on the interval episode we did with you of people saying, I tried those intervals. Like, for some reason, people have really jumped on the 4x8s. Our listeners have.
Yeah.
And keep getting this feedback of, it didn't feel all that hard. Am I doing this right? I didn't crawl off my bike. Is something wrong here? And I think that goes back to what you're saying of a lot of people are used to being in that chronically overreach state. And sometimes it can be a struggle to think, I'm going to do some intensity, but I'm going to walk away from it and be okay.
Yeah, with my daughter, sometimes I say, look, I want you to always have one more in the tank.
Yep.
In other words, one more interval. You could have done one or two more. When we're in the build phase, we don't want to hit that absolute red line too often because, it's just a costly game. So I have no problem with the athlete leaving the track or leaving the bike with just a little bit left in the tank, because I think, again, that makes it a sustainable process of doing the work. And if they have that figured out, then everything we've been talking about with this overreaching, then there is the potential to use that tool in the toolbox. But it's not going to be a useful tool if they're not controlling themselves during the daily training. I think that's what connects these two, is this high risk protocol is less risky if they've been doing things right and giving themselves some room, giving their bodies some room for a peaking process where their body is responsive to it.
I mean, those are good closing statements in a way, but maybe it's time for us to wrap up the episode with our take-home messages. 60 seconds is what we normally give guests. Dr. Seiler, I'll give you 65 today if you want them. What's the biggest take-home message you'd like people to leave with today?
Overtraining, true overtraining syndrome is a very rare but very serious condition. I hope none of our athletes face it. And the way to avoid it is obviously with good intensity distribution, respect for the value of rest and recovery. And then we've talked a lot about this overreach as a potential tool, a weapon, or a method for trying to get a little bit more out of our bodies for a peak. I would say that is one of those kind of top end of the hierarchy things we try after we've got all the basics right. The basics of training, intensity distribution, the volume, all of those things. Let's do that first. And then with having a good conversation with coach and understanding the risks involved, then make an intelligent gamble on these peaking strategies or overreach super comp strategies.
Trevor, what would you add here?
So the motivator of this whole episode was defining the difference between these terms. And the more I've read about them, the more I really like the terms, because I think before there was this notion that there's overreach and overtraining, and overreach is good, overtraining is bad. We've definitely established overtraining is bad, But I like better this concept of functional versus non-functional overreach, and the fact that it's not that big a jump to go from one to the other. So coaches have often referred to this as riding the razor's edge, and that's exactly what you're doing. So going back to what Dr. Seiler was talking about, if you're going to play with functional overreach, you are riding the edge, and it's very easy to go over it. So do it sparingly, be careful, and make sure you have the self-awareness to make sure that you don't go over. Otherwise, just good, solid, steady, consistent training is probably going to get you to the best place.
Yeah. I guess the one thing I would add here is the fact that, we do toss these terms around somewhat interchangeably and incorrectly. So most people out there, it sounds to me after this whole discussion that overreaching and doing it correctly is really hard to do. So more than likely, most people who are attempting it might not be getting it right. And a lot more people are probably doing it in a non-functional way or in a chronic way, and they've stagnated. So I think it's good to, all of this discussion helps people maybe step back and look at what they've done and try to assess where they're at in a broader sense, and maybe tweak some things to actually refine what they're doing, distribute things a little bit more positively, if you will. Hopefully it's been a helpful discussion.
Dr. Seiler, thank you as always. Always great having you on the show. This was a fascinating discussion. I was looking forward to this one.
Yeah, great to be here. And I guess I was on the razor's edge as well, because this is tough. It's not as cut and dry as a physiologist like myself would like it to be.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@fastlabs.com or record a voice memo on your phone and send those questions our way. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcast, and be sure to leave us a rating and a review. Find us on social. We're at Real Fast Labs, and we're online at fastlabs.com. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Dr. Stephen Seiler, Sebastian Weber, Jim Miller, Payson McKelvin, Neil Henderson, and Trevor Connor, I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.